This book blew me away. I've been obsessed with this book for the past couple of months, and it was actually written in 1967 and updated a few times since then, most recently in 1985, but it's so prescient in terms of describing the way the economy has evolved. And he basically describes the economy, or the corporate part of the economy, as this technostructure, which I think is brilliant. And the technostructure basically includes both the corporate sector and the government sector, and in a lot of ways the collusion between those two for mutual interest. And it's provocative because at one point he says someday they're going to look back at history and laugh at the notion that the corporations were separate from the state. Like, look at this quote. He says, "People will look back in amusement at the pretense that once led inspired executives and their public relations men to refer to General Dynamics, Lockheed, and AT&T as private businesses." And at other times, he calls this technostructure the planning system, because he's making an analogy between sort of the way corporations and the corporate ecosystem is moving in the US and the USSR at the time, which had a centralized planning system. And he was basically saying our system in the United States was moving more and more toward a centrally planned system through this corporate technostructure. Now, one way I might characterize this to be a little bit provocative is that he's kind of making the case that capitalism depreciates toward socialism or communism. Now, he would not use the word depreciate because depreciate assumes it's a negative thing. And most of his book is actually just describing how things are, like what is the way things are working and what are the mechanisms by which they work. And he doesn't have that much that's sort of him weighing in on, is this good or bad? But when he does, he's a very two-handed economist. He's sort of like, on one hand, it's good because of this. On the other hand, it's bad because of this. And he at one point says, we don't really know how this is going to pan out, whether the bad parts of this are going to be counteracted essentially by academia. That's his hope, is that academia counteracts the negative parts of the corporate technostructure and the way it's evolving. So I would just like to go through how he's envisioning the economy, how it works, how it has changed over time as large corporations have kind of taken over the economic system. So first off, he actually points out that economists are studying a subject that is changing. And he compares this, of course, to other fields like physics and biology that are studying something that is more or less the same. So they don't have to update their theories when the laws of physics change. But economists have to update their theories as the progression through history changes the nature of the economy. And he makes the case that the source of economic power has shifted over time, where at one point, several hundred years ago, ownership of land was the source of economic power. And then, of course, with the advent of capitalism, capital and the ownership of the machines and the factories that produced stuff, that became the new source of economic power. Now, he's arguing that actually we have moved beyond that and there is a different source of economic power, which is no longer the classic capital as we think of it in terms of machines, but rather it's management of collective intelligence. Now, he uses the term organized intelligence instead of collective intelligence, but I'm going to use collective intelligence because that's sort of one of the things that I'm thinking about on this channel. And the reason why power has shifted to managed collective intelligence in this new economy, the new industrial state, is because of the complexity of the economy and the need for specialized expertise. Now, you might think when you hear this that, okay, the people with the power are now the CEOs. And I think there's partial truth to that in the way he's framing it. But he also basically says actually some of the power for decision-making in corporations has been distributed down to the specialized workers. Like the workers who have expertise that the organization could not get by without. And of course, if you have this distributed intelligence and distributed power, you need some way of managing it such that all of these specialists are working together to produce one thing that's unified. And the nature of that is that it's collective. You've got committees all over the place. You've got internal power dynamics. And you've got the C-suite of people who are managing all of that. And that's essentially where he lands the locus of power. And part of his story here is that this big complex process requires so much coordination and so much time to build that infrastructure that the corporation essentially has to manage demand. They have to decide what to produce before they know if people will want it. And therefore, they're going to have to invest a lot of money in advertising and mass communication and public relations so that they can sell the product or they can create the demand they need to self-sustain the organization. Now, when he characterizes these corporations, he actually makes the case that they're not just maximizing profit for their shareholders. Like, they have to give their shareholders enough profit so that they stay in business. But he actually compares them to what we would think of as bureaucracies, where the goal essentially is to make your little bureaucracy bigger and bigger and bigger. And of course, the number one goal is going to be self-preservation. You want your bureaucracy that you're managing, that you're part of, that makes up your in-group. You want that to persist through economic downturns, through changes in legislation. So that's the number one goal. But you also just want to make yourself bigger. And that's something we see in bureaucracies. He's making the case that we also see it in corporations. And he's setting up this collective personality of these organizations with a series of goals, where the first goal, of course, is self-preservation. The second goal is autonomy for the organization. Like, the people in the organization, they have power battles between each other, but they also have sort of goals as a group, and they don't want to be imposed upon by government or by society that might have different ideas. So the autonomy of the organization is another thing they're maximizing. And next, it's going to be growth in the size of the organization, because that's how all bureaucracies work, and there's a bureaucratic nature to this. And then fourth, there has to be social goals. And the social goals of the people within the organization, and especially the people closer to the center, the CEO and the C-suite people, those social goals are actually going to be really important for motivating workers, for motivating leadership in an organization. So allowing them to have some influence on the organization in terms of their social goals is going to be key. Now, he compares corporations with entrepreneurs. And he points out that these two are different beasts. They don't have the same economic nature, the same economic incentives. And with entrepreneurs, the entrepreneur's creativity and charisma and vision and the way they're in touch with the needs of the population, that is sort of primary. And any business that's started by an entrepreneur, it's going to have that entrepreneur as a key shaper of the quality of that business, the nature of that business. And that creativity, for a lot of economists, is sort of central to a thriving economy. However, at some point, that organization has to pass over into the hands of someone with a different skill set, which is the skill set of managing something that has already been brought into being. And so the heads of corporations, like the CEOs who inherit companies that were once the pursuit of an entrepreneur, those people have a different skill set. And their skill set is sort of managing these collective groups, managing collective intelligence. And he points out that actually sometimes it doesn't matter that much who is at the head of a corporation. Like, a lot of times when the CEO of a corporation switches from one person to another, it's not dramatic news. It's just sort of, okay, this is a routine changing in leadership, rather than with entrepreneurs, when that entrepreneur gets sick or goes to the hospital or dies, there could be a huge disruption in terms of whether or not that company will succeed. And he makes the case that these corporations, they manage their shareholders in the same way they manage the government and they manage their customers by giving their shareholders enough to keep them happy, telling them a story that makes it seem like they're maximizing profit, when really the organization is maximizing its own interests. Now, economists care a lot about incentivizing workers and motivation. And he basically has 4 different ways that he sees that workers can be motivated, where the first is coercion of some sort, whether that's force or threats or whatnot. The second will be reward, such as financial reward, payment. The third is going to be identification with the cause, like the social cause and the value that an organization has. And for that one, we might think actually when people donate time to their church or donate time to a political group that they're involved with, they're very passionate about that. And that leads to really good work. Like it leads to well-aligned incentives. And then the fourth way that people can be motivated is if they hope that they can bend the organization's purposes and bend its will to their own purposes. If they see that, oh, I as an individual do not have power to enact in the world, but if I got inside this organization, I could actually shape its mission toward what I perceive as a pro-social endeavor. And these latter 2 motivations, he clusters those together and says these are identification, where the worker identifies with the values and the goals of the firm, and where that is the main motivator behind them working. And he talks historically about how initially coercion was one of the main motivators for work. That's part of slavery. That's part of a lot of what was going on, say, a couple thousand years ago. And then financial payment became something that was more and more common because, of course, financial payment is generally going to be more effective than coercion. Because, of course, coercion is going to get resistance and shirking and sort of bad feelings between the employer and the worker. But he basically says the technostructure relies mainly on identification, mainly on the latter 2 of these things. And he also sort of compares different types of workers where lower income workers tend to be more in the category of work for pay, of number 2 really, whereas higher income workers and more creative workers, workers who identify with their jobs, they tend to be these salaried workers. And that's basically the basis of the motivational structure in these huge corporations. And let me read an interesting quote from this section. He says, individuals have a well-remarked capacity to attach high social purpose to whatever serves their personal interest. The corporation becomes, thus, an instrument for attributing social purpose to the goals of those who comprise it. Much of what is believed to be socially important is, in fact, the adaptation of social attitudes to the goal system of the technostructure. And of course, he says this is a 2-way street between the workers and the center of the technostructure, where the technostructure wants workers to adapt its goals. Workers want the technostructure to bend its will toward their goals. And there's a back and forth influence on the part of workers, and especially workers closer to the center of the technostructure. Now, regarding the center of the technostructure, he actually rejects the classic way of visualizing corporations as a hierarchical pyramid. He says he prefers a way of visualizing corporations where the CEO and the C-suite are in the middle of centrifugal circles. And the workers on the edge who aren't as committed to the goals of the organization, they're sort of out on the edges. And as you move your way up within a corporation, you essentially move your way in toward the center. And he basically says that as you move closer and closer to the center of the technostructure, the identification with the social purposes of the corporation become more and more important. Now, he also talks about the ways that the technostructure and that these corporations can exert influence on both the population and also on their workers and also on the government, and especially the government that they are interacting with as a part of their regular business. And these tools of influence fall into a couple of different categories, where the first category is advertising and mass communication. He basically says the corporate technostructure has control over those aspects of mass media and mass communication. And through that means, they actually influence the demands of the population, the perspective of the population, and the desires of the population. He calls this the revised sequence, where we classically think of economics as the population has needs, they demand goods and services with those needs, and that the providers, the producers, supply those. So that's the sequence that initiates with the needs of the population. He flips it on its head and says, actually, the technostructure needs to preserve its value. It needs to grow bigger, like corporations need to grow bigger. And as such, they influence the population and the expectations, the demands, and the needs of the population through whatever means they can, and that leads the population to then demand what they need from the corporate technostructure. So this revised sequence is basically saying a lot of the population demands do initiate with what the technostructure hopes that they will demand. Now, the other type of influence from the technostructure has to do with sort of social influence as you go about your business day, interacting with people, developing groupthink, developing rapport with people around you, taking on the values of people around you. And I think that's a really insightful point, that people do tend to attune to the needs and the values and the hopes of those that they spend the most time with. And of course, he says that this happens both within corporations, but also between corporations and the government, where if you're constantly interacting as a corporation with a regulator, then you have these habits and these patterns, and you learn to understand the needs and desires of those people in a way that will lead people to naturally adopt desires that align. And I would call this attunement. And I would also add to this phenomenon the notion that people who want to move up inside the technostructure, they know that they have to attune themselves to the goals of people above them, or they're not going to be favored in the merit process. Because merit, of course, is not just competence, it's how well are your goals aligned with those who are selecting who moves up. So I think all of those are means by which corporations influence people's values and people's tastes. Now let's look at the state and the corporate sector, because he makes an argument that there is a mutual two-way relationship between those, where they both want and need something from the other. And a lot of what's going on is those two groups becoming more and more identified with each other over time. So first, what does the corporation need from the state? And one thing it needs is it needs demand for its services. So government contracts, he's pointing out, are a larger and larger share of the economy, where even if it's a private business, it's a private business whose customer is the government. And this includes military contracts, it includes education-based contracts, infrastructure contracts, contracts for health insurance, contracts for all of these things that the government does. And as that relationship blows up, it changes the structure of the economy. Another one of the central things that the corporate technostructure needs from the government is stability and control over aggregate demand. Now, aggregate demand is an economics-y term, but it basically means control over the business cycle. Because if you think about the number one goal of corporations being self-preservation, that they want to make sure that they outlast the economy, that they outlast the downturns in the economy. The biggest moment of risk for these corporations is, of course, when the economy turns downward, which is when businesses tend to go out of business. So to prevent that, there is a strong incentive to make sure the business cycle is smoothed, that downturns don't lead to corporations going out of business. Now, maybe they're okay with small businesses going out of business, and especially if those small businesses are potential competitors. But control over aggregate demand is one of his main points in this book, is that the corporate sector wants control over aggregate demand, and they do that through this mutual relationship with the government. And it's not just self-preservation that's driving this, it's also the demand for stability, because the technostructure really likes predictability and stability. Controlling aggregate demand is part of that. Now, the government also funds education and investment in infrastructure, both of which corporations depend on heavily. So that's another need from the corporations, that they get met through the government. But then needs also go in the opposite direction. So the government needs the corporate technostructure because it relies on them for mass communication. Like, government officials need to be reelected, they need the population on board with their endeavors. And because corporations have control over the media and advertising and influence over the population, they need the corporate technostructure to be on board with them. There's also jobs. Public officials are not going to be reelected if these big corporations suddenly let go of a bunch of workers. Like, that's going to look really, really bad. And it will be blamed on the government. So in some ways, that's a moment of leverage that corporations have over the government. They could, get rid of a bunch of workers, and by doing so, they have the power to unelect or prevent re-election of the existing government. And then, of course, the government relies on the private sector, and in particular corporations, to supply its needs for weapons and infrastructure and everything that it's buying. Most of what the government buys is through these contracts with the government. So those contracts are a real point of mutuality between the state and corporations. And then he says this mutuality gets heightened because there's constant interaction between the corporate sector and the government, where part of this is the revolving door. It's the fact that a lot of these technical workers will go back and forth between working for the government regulators, and then they'll get a much more lucrative job in these corporations, and they have to kind of keep their eye out moving between these two sectors. And then just the fact that they call each other up all the time, they know each other's business cycles, they interact with people between the corporate sector and the government. In fact, a lot of consulting firms spend a whole lot of money wining and dining people in the government who are in charge of deciding which corporation gets these lucrative contracts. So there is this social relationship and this habit that goes along with these two sectors that will naturally reinforce their mutual interest. So here's a quote on that. "Members are intermingled in daily work. Each organization comes to accept the other's goals. Each adapts the goals of the other to its own." And when he thinks about class, he thinks the relevant class distinction is between the workers that are essential to the technostructure, which he counts as being these highly educated engineers and managers and technical workers with specialized expertise that the technostructure relies upon. Those workers actually have some power and some voice inside these firms. Whereas workers that are easily replaceable, such as blue-collar workers, they are going to have a very different level of power and level of influence over the social goals of corporations. And let me read this quote. "Politics also reflects this new division. In the United States, suspicion or resentment is no longer directed at the capitalists or the merely rich. It is the intellectuals, the effete snobs, who are eyed with misgiving and alarm. This reflects the relevant class distinction of our time. There's also the notion of workers and geography. And he points out that cities that sort of cater to these highly educated engineers and scientists and manager class, those cities are going to do really well economically in this new system that favors the corporate technostructure. Whereas cities with a more working class population are going to decline economically because their power is reduced over time. And you see this in Enrico Moretti's book, The New Geography of Jobs, which basically makes the case that exactly this is happening, that the economic prosperity of a city is highly correlated with how many of these creative class and managerial class workers this city attracts. And of course, to attract those workers, you need these cultural elements, you need, parks and theaters and certain things that this class is attracted to. He also talks about unions and how unions will naturally decline in this system because of those four motivational forces and the fact that the latter two, the two that where the worker identifies with the goals of the firm, that is not very in line with an adversarial relationship between workers and the firm. So if workers believe in the mission of the firm and if they're, on board to do their job as it relates to the social mission of the firm, then they're probably not going to go on strike as much. They're not going to empower an adversarial union. But of course, he says unions can actually serve the purposes of the technostructure well if they get workers on board with the goals of the firm. Also, unions can standardize wages across an industry, which could really help with the stability that the technostructure is after. So with all of this, he's basically making the argument that our system, our economic system, is becoming more and more like a centrally planned system, where the central planning happens through the corporate ecostructure. Now, is that good or bad? And he makes the case for both. He says, on one hand, it's good because the technostructure in this format, it is somewhat responsive to people's physical needs. It also promotes investment in education because that serves the technostructure's needs. So better schools, better K through 12, better higher education, more programs for scientists and engineers, all of that will be a natural result of the rise in the corporate technostructure. There are benefits to the technostructure's control over aggregate demand, that it stabilizes the economy, it makes things more predictable. It promotes building of infrastructure and building of suburban areas where the workers that the technostructure need can live and thrive. On the other hand, there are some things that this technostructure will not really care about that much. And this includes care for the ill, the aged, the physically or mentally infirm. It includes care for low-income people who don't necessarily have a place in this technostructure. He points out that the technostructure is going to favor the automobile industry since that's part of the corporate technostructure, and therefore it will disfavor public transportation that reduces reliance on cars. So it will favor very much building of highways, building of road systems that drive people out to the suburbs, but not so much buses and subway systems and whatnot. The corporate technostructure doesn't care so much about aesthetics because, of course, factories and billboards and all of those those support the technostructure, and they kind of degrade the aesthetics of city environments. Now, he mentions the environment, like the corporate technostructure doesn't necessarily want to focus on the negative effects of its own behavior. But he doesn't talk a whole lot about that. And maybe that's because the corporate technostructure could be a solution to environmental issues. But of course, it won't be a solution to all environmental issues. So my own view on this, at least, is that if you divide environmental issues into those that are easily dealt with by the corporate sector, and those that are not easily dealt with or that are very threatening to the corporate sector. The advertising and the influence that the corporate sector uses in its mass communication will emphasize the ones it can deal with well, like, oh, we can build better technology that handles green technology, but it will minimize the environmental problems that it cannot deal with well. And then one of the downsides here may have to do with freedom, because of course, the more and more control that this technostructure amasses, perhaps it may be taking some of that control away from people, and especially people who are not at its center. So let me read you a quote on that. The two questions most asked about an economic system are whether it serves man's physical needs and whether it is consistent with his liberty. The danger to liberty lies in the subordination of belief to the needs of the planning system. So the fact that the planning system is going to target people's psychic needs, as he says, it's going to target people's insecurities and their psychological feeling like they need more. And it's going to do that in a way that is perhaps limiting on freedom. Another problem he points out is the potential promotion of debt. Because if workers are indebted, like if they're in debt on credit card debt or if they're in debt in any way, then they are more a slave to their jobs in the corporate technostructure. And that gives more power to the corporations to keep them under their thumb. So the promotion of people being in debt in any way is something that could be exacerbated by the incentives set up in this system. Now, the last one here is going to relate to his perception of how we counteract this problem. And that is in education. Of course, that's part of the good side of the corporate technostructure, that it promotes education. But on the other hand, it also wants to stifle education that challenges the corporate technostructure. Let me read you a quote here. But unless its tendencies are clearly foreseen and strongly resisted, it will place a preclusive emphasis on education that most serves the needs, but least questions the goals of that system. So any education that questions what is going on with the corporate technostructure, he says that kind of education will be suppressed, diminished, disinvested in. And because there is this relationship between the state and the corporations, there could be a rejiggering of education to make sure they're bringing up, say, economists who have theories that support this technostructure, including supporting control over aggregate demand, and to disfavor economists who point out these flaws with the technostructure. And his solution then is for people in academia who he points out have some power in the system. He says those are the people who should speak out and counteract the negative effects of this economic system. And he says it's really important for higher education in particular to maintain control over its budgets so that it can invest where it sees fit, rather than having corporations and the government dictate which departments in academia will get bigger, which will get smaller, and whatnot. Now, I will leave it to you to decide whether you think academia is more in support of this technostructure, this corporation-state partnership technostructure, or whether academia is challenging it adequately. He points out that the social sciences no longer have a tone of a revolution, and that's sort of him saying, actually, it seems like both economics and social sciences in general are less and less critiquing what is happening with the state and corporations, and how somehow there's a de-emphasis on the fact that oligopolies act like monopolies. Like that's just not coming up as much, such that even though there is antitrust law and legislation that goes after monopoly power, there is a less emphasis and less focus on the power of oligopolies to behave like a monopoly. And he has some other critiques of economists, but this video is probably long enough, so I will leave it there.